within that genre, there's a global appeal. I mean, the American Western genre, it's almost like Greek mythology. It's appealing to different people.
From the Autry Museum, located on Tongva Homelands in Los Angeles, California, join us in asking, what is a Western? Our guest today, Professor Didier Gondola. He's the chair of the History Department and a professor of African History and Africana Studies at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. He has written on numerous subjects in African history and the history of the African diaspora, and he's here to talk today about his book, Tropical Cowboys, Westerns, Violence, and Masculinity in Kinshasa. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Josh. I'm really delighted to be kind of the inaugural expert for this series, and thank you very much for inviting me.
The fact that youth gangs in Kinshasa in around the 1950s modeled their identities on Western movies and cowboys, and specifically the character of Buffalo Bill, they called themselves Les Billes or the Bills, was unfamiliar to me. It's probably unfamiliar to most people. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the Bills?
Yeah, okay. So I think this was a very good starting point. The fact that you mentioned Western movies, and especially you mentioned the figure of Buffalo Bill, because Buffalo Bill is actually the eponymous hero of those young people in Kinshasa in the 1950s. So they were actually exposed to the Western genre by Belgian missionaries in the 1950s. And there are two specific movies that we definitely need to mention because, I did field work speaking to my informants, and then most of the time, the two movies that came up were Pony Express, which is a movie that was released in American theaters in 1953, and then it was dubbed in French and released in France 1954. And in 1954, it's in Kinshasa. Okay, and Charlton Heston actually plays the role of Buffalo Bill. This kind of is the very iconic movie that really inspired the movement. The second movie that was really important was actually not a movie in the big theaters, but it was a TV series called The Lone Ranger. Very interesting that The Lone Ranger actually started out as a radio show in 1933 in the US. And what my informants, the Bills didn't know is that the inspiration for the Lone Ranger is actually not a white person, but a black person. It's a deputy U.S. Marshal by the name of Bass Reeves, who was actually active in Arkansas and in the Oklahoma Territory after the Civil War. So he's actually the Lone Ranger. Mm-hmm. But the Lone Ranger that was played by Clinton Moore, mm-hmm. It's a white person and not a black person, which is really interesting. So those young people in Kinshasa in the 1950s were watching those movies. They were captivated by the movies. They were very mesmerized by the Hollywood scripts, of the Far West. And what they did is to parlay that from the screen onto the streets of Kinshasa. The first thing that they did is that they created gangs of bills in every single township in Kinshasa. And those young people, probably from the age of, I would say, 9, 10, all the way to, 18. Some of them were even older. So they created those gangs of bills. Each township in Kinshasa had a gang of bills. They organized a lot of performative fightings. They were fighting all the time. They were fighting over nicknames. All the nicknames were from the repertoire of the American Far West. So they would take up the names like John Wayne, and Buffalo, or Billy, or different names of real actors and figures of the Far West. They would fight over turfs. They would fight over girls, of course. They would smoke marijuana. They would dress up in a cowboy attire, with the hats, the checkered shirts, the pants, of course, the boots and the spurs. They had pistols, but the pistols were fake. The only thing that they really didn't have was the horse. And instead of the horse, they would use a bicycle. Okay, so they would remove the brakes, to make it look more like a horse, with the brakes. So they were kind of very interesting because they were Janus-faced, protecting their neighborhood, their townships, but also predating on girls and other gangs, actually, townships. So really kind of a very versatile figure. By the end of the 1950s, every single township in Kinshasa had a gang of Bills.
So why Buffalo Bill, or what is so special about him as an icon?
Well, Buffalo Bill is a very interesting figure of the Far West. He died in 1917, and he was eulogized, by so many people. What's interesting about him is that at the time when the West was disappearing, because the frontier had actually gone all the way to the Pacific, Buffalo Bill was present in the U.S., but he also was playing his own role. He was playing himself on stage, in dime novels, of course, in film, even in film. And he took the Wild West show, as you know, to avid crowds all over the world, including in Europe, before Queen Victoria. He went to Rome, there was a Pope, he actually performed before Pope Leo X, I believe. He even went to France. And then there's this great image that I really like of Buffalo Bill, almost like a prophet. There's Buffalo Bill, and then there's a buffalo, and the picture of Buffalo Bill is right in the middle. And then at the very bottom, the words "Je viens" in French, which means I am coming, in a very prophetic way. So Buffalo Bill is being embraced, worldwide, beyond the U.S., in Europe, in Africa, in Kinshasa. So there is something about Buffalo Bill that made him successful, that really made him an iconic figure, larger than nature, that was embraced by those young people who wanted to be like him.
Just rewinding a little bit to give those of us who don't know that much about African history a little bit of the context. What was this period in the Belgian Congo like, and where did it kind of come out? What was, just in the thumbnail sense, I know you probably teach whole courses on this, but sort of what's the context that these townships are kind of coming out of?
What's interesting is that you look at the trajectory of the Belgian Congo. Initially, before it was a colony, it was actually the private property of a king. King Leopold II actually owned this place. We are talking, geographically speaking, of a place that's as large as the United States of America, east of the Mississippi River. So that's Western Europe, a huge colony with over 350 different ethnic groups, a lot of different resources. The leitmotif that I see in the history of Congo is that it was a place that was plundered. Was plundered by Leopold II. So it became really the Belgian Congo in 1909 until it was independent in 1960. So what replaced this kind of reign of terror that was imposed by Leopold II all the way to 1908 was a sort of kind of a paternalistic regime, a little similar to what was happening in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa. The Belgians, through the missionaries, through the administrators, through the different companies, colonial companies, it basically subjugated African men, especially, to a very harsh regime where even the humanity of African people and Congolese people were denied. And especially with the men, there was this attempt to emasculate the Congolese man, to infantilize the Congolese man, that was depicted as a big child, right? And even sometimes to animalize the Congolese man. So it was a very oppressive environment, especially in the urban areas in the 1950s, and especially in Kinshasa, the largest city in the Belgian colony.
That note about masculinity kind of leads to my next question, which is, what's your interpretation? So when these young men see Westerns, it seems like they really seize onto it, right? That there is something to, as a model of masculinity, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So they see a potential, they see different scripts, they see different ways of being a man, right? Because the image that the colonial environment actually projected was not the image of a strong Congolese man. It was the image of a man-child, right? So the cowboy movies, the Westerns actually provided different scripts that they could use in their attempt to kind of forge new norms and new standards of manliness, masculinity, manhood, and so on. The cowboy really kind of captivated them, with his swagger, his grit, the fact that he was riding on his horse and going to right wrongs, sometimes in a very violent way. That's really something that really appealed to the young people in Kinshasa. I spoke with some of my informants. They told me that the experience of watching a movie in a theater in Kinshasa was actually louder than going to a soccer stadium. It was pandemonium. It was just really crazy, So what kind of drew them to the movie, the Western movie, was the action. It's the action. It's the people fighting, chases and things like that. Really kind of mesmerized them. Really, they became really enamored, with the Western genre. They basically tried to parlay that from the screen to the streets of Kinshasa.
So, and that included kind of some things we'd say is both good and bad, right? In terms of sort of
Absolutely.
Rescue kind of ideas, but also kind of violent striking out examples. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's really part of the global appeal of the Western movie. It's the binary nature of the Western. Good guys, bad guys. Heroes and villains. And heroes and zeros. Those Congolese young people, young viewers, they were oppressed by white men. They were oppressed by Belgians. But yet, when they were watching the Western movies, they identified themselves with the cowboys, not with the Indians, because the Indians were also the victims. The young people were also the victims. But as a young person, you will not identify yourself with a loser, So they were after modernity, and I think that the cowboy really became a figure of modernity that they could emulate, they could look up to.
And then you say in the book that this actually had political ramifications. These movements actually, it wasn't just a fashion trend or something like this. It actually played out in the streets. Yeah?
Absolutely, because I think that by nature, popular culture is always very subversive. It's not just performative. To me, it's always a side of resistance. And their movement indeed was, if you look at that, especially in the context of decolonization, because the late 1950s, all over the place in Africa, colonies are becoming independent. But the Belgian Congo was an exception because it was basically the only colony that the Belgians had. And this was the richest colony on earth. They wanted to keep it. In 1956, there's a Belgian professor by the name of Van Bilsen comes up with a plan to emancipate Congo in 30 years. So according to the plan, Congo would have been independent in 1986. In 1959, in the month of January, very early, I think it was January the 4th, there was a political rally, and then the colonial authorities decided to cancel the rally, and people were not happy, and they started marching and demonstrating. It was something really small that could have stayed small. But the bills actually hijacked this kind of spirit of insurrection. And they spread that spirit of insurrection all over the townships in Kinshasa. The Belgians had to bring the army in from abroad, from Belgium, to quell that. It mushroomed into a huge insurrection that lasted for days and days and days until on January the 13th, finally the King of Belgium decided to say, well, we're going to make sure that you are granted independence sooner than 1986. As a matter of fact, Congo became independent in 1960. You see? So the point that I'm making in my book, it wasn't the Congolese political elite that basically sped up the decolonization process for Congo to become independent. It was the Bills through their popular culture of performativity, but also resistance and subversion.
So when people sort of talk about the American spirit abroad, we sort of think of like the Constitution or the sort of the ideals, but it's in some ways it's the sort of most popular, lowbrow kind of culture in this case that did have a real effect.
And a real impact. I mean, young people wouldn't be interested in the U.S. Constitution. It's not fun, right? It's not appealing to them, What appealed to them really was the Western genre. And I think that, I cannot overstate it, but within that genre, there's a global appeal. I mean, to me, the American Western genre, it's almost like Greek mythology. It's appealing to different people. And what happens is that there's processes of reappropriation. They reappropriated the Western, they infused local ideas, traditional ideas, and they created a very hybrid culture. So I'm not saying that, they took the Hollywood rendition of the Far West and then, they used it in Kinshasa. What I'm saying is that there were processes of transformation, appropriation to really make it fit within the urban context of the late 1950s in Kinshasa.
It's just a fascinating context in which to examine the Western, sort of so far from here in Los Angeles and Hollywood, where so many of them were created, but that it really had this impact and was reappropriated in a totally different context.
Even because there's a versatility in the term bill, because sometimes they would use Yankee. So Yankee and Bill, it was really interchangeable. So the movement actually petered out around 1960, 1961, and 1962, especially when Mobutu, who became president in 1965, kind of co-opted the movement. He understood that this movement could be a threat if it weren't controlled. So he co-opted a lot of those young people. So the movement kind of, died off and died down and so on. But there are some remnants. Today in Kinshasa, for example, if somebody's tough, a tough person, they would say, oh, this guy is a Bill, or this guy is a Yankee. So they remember that because their culture left such a huge impact on the culture, the conscience of the people in Kinshasa. It's not gendered in the sense that they would use that for women as well. If the woman is tough, you go to the marketplace to buy food and you try to negotiate with the woman, for her to lower the price and, she's not budging, you may say that, oh, this woman is really a Yankee or she's a Bill, meaning that she's tough. So it became a kind of a one size fits all. And it is just really fascinating to see the trajectory of the term Bill or the term Yankee in Kinshasa's contemporary culture, the way people use that even to this day.
Did this story become interesting to you, do you think, from your experience here, like in conversation between being immersed in American culture and versus French culture or African cultures? Did it strike you differently, do you think, because you've been teaching here?
I don't know if I would have written that book the way I wrote it had I stayed in France or in Congo. So yeah, definitely being here endowed the book with richness that I wouldn't have found had I stayed in France.
Well, that's great. It's been so great talking to you.
It was just a pleasure, such an honor for me to be part of this conversation and part of this series. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, well, no, thank you for joining. All right. Take care.
You too.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.